That damn morning, I got woken up by a phone call. I unwillingly reached out to the nightstand where the phone was lying, hit the lock button, dropped the call, turned over to the other side, and fell asleep again. Probably in less than a minute, the call rang out again. Being pissed off, I jumped out of bed and grabbed the phone and answered the call. Having heard the voice of Dr. Vladimir Anatolievich, I instantly woke up. Why? I'll tell you now. This doctor was the head of the department in the hospital where my mother was being treated. My mom fell seriously ill a month ago, suddenly and mysteriously, but more on that later. So Vladimir Anatolievich, in a monstrous, indifferent voice, told me that my mom wasn't getting any better. They kept her condition stable, but there was no sense in keeping her in the hospital. In general, he politely hinted to me that I had to take my mother with all her stuff out of the hospital and keep treating her at home. Having sweared, I hung up and threw the phone somewhere to the pillows. My little son ran into the room.
Dad, what's up? Who's called?
Good morning, son. I turned to the entrance with a strained smile. Nothing.
Has anybody called from the hospital? How's Grandma feeling?
Now I'm going to take your grandmother home.
Hooray! Has she recovered?
Well, I started thinking. Let's say so, I said quietly. But we'll probably have to treat her at home.
All right, I'll look after her while you are at work.
Oh, my little boy, I said with a real smile and hugged my son. Okay, I'm gonna get ready and I'll go to the hospital.
Can I go with you, Dad?
What for? I'll go there and be back soon. Go to brush your teeth. Meanwhile, I'll make some breakfast.
All right.
He smiled and went to the bathroom. While I was cooking an omelet with toast, some thoughts were floating in my head. Oh, right. I was going to tell you what's wrong with my mom. One night, I don't remember when exactly, my mom's neighbor Sveta called me. Well, my mom lived in the village, not far from our city at all. So, she called, I answered. I was still at work and she cried saying that my mom was feeling extremely bad. This neighbor heard my mom's cries and she came running into the house and was about to faint because of what she had seen in the grandma's bedroom. My mom was lying and screaming at the top of her lungs, grabbing everything around her like a woman who's giving birth to a child. She turned so pale, her pupils narrowed like small black beads, but the screaming just made her shiver, as the neighbor told me later. Then she called an ambulance, and my mother was taken to the hospital, and I instantly arrived there. Mom was injected with something, and she fell asleep while being in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, as the doctor told me later. I spent almost all night in the ward. Only when it was already done, I went home because Grisha had to get ready for school. I visited her every day. Well, what can I say? The very next day after my mom was taken to the hospital, she felt way better, but she changed. At first I didn't pay much attention to it, but then I started to peer into every moment, listening to every word that was wrong. As I've said, on the first day, everything seemed to be fine, but then she began to have some kind of bizarre movements. Sometimes she waved her hand as if she was trying to chase away a fly, but there was no trace of them at all. And when she was talking either to me or to the doctors, she was gesturing as she never did before. She was always talking to someone and keeping her hands close to herself. There was some strange accent in her speech, or it was a kind of speech defect. Yeah, right. It was a speech defect. The most interesting thing is that the doctors just shrugged their shoulders. They ran some tests, examined everything from head to toe. Everything was fine. The tests were okay. They took a blood test, made an x-ray. Everything was fine. Only the chief physician assumed it could be epilepsy, or even worse, Alzheimer's disease. Well, then it was getting even worse. On the 5th day of treatment, my mother had some kind of apathy. Before that, she talked to people, smiled. Then she was lying on the bed with a stony glare on her face. She lost her interest in absolutely everything. She stopped eating, only occasionally drank some water. On the 6th day, her hands started shaking. Her memory slowly disappeared. On the 15th day, she didn't recognize me. I realized that my mother was slowly but surely turning into a vegetable. And because of this, I could not work well. I slept badly. I was constantly nervous. I even forgot the last time I checked my son's diary. All this time, she simply stayed in bed. Only sometimes she was accompanied to the toilet, and she also could shit herself when there was no one around. After she stopped recognizing me, I stopped entering the ward. I only brought some medicines and gave them to the doctors. And 5 days ago, the doctor called me and said that my mom had an attack again, and she had injured one of the orderlies. I instantly arrived to the hospital. The first thing I saw was the bustle around the ward and a young guy with a bandaged leg. As I found out later, my mother tore off a piece of skin from his leg. When we were smoking, standing at the entrance to the hospital, the orderly told me later that he approached her to carry away a bedpan while she suddenly grabbed him by the leg. She squeezed his leg with her nails so much that the poor guy started yelling that it echoed through the entire department. Then she twisted and pulled out a piece of flesh along with the cloth from his pants. Blood started to gush to the floor, and almost the entire hospital came there. Mom was twitching and arching again, screaming like that night when they took her. After this incident, they looked sideways at me and at my mother, and I completely understood them. I paid for all the medications for the orderly and gave him some money as an apology. Then my mom was injected with something again and she fell asleep. Well, it had been lasting until that day, or rather until that morning, when the call woke me up. Let's go back. Let's say, to the very beginning. Then I gave breakfast to Grisha, cleaned my teeth, got dressed, and went out into the hallway. Putting my hand on the door, I started thinking where we should put my mom. Our apartment isn't that big. There are 2 rooms and 2 sofas. We can't put her here. Son?
Yeah, Dad?
He answered out of his room. Get ready, we'll go together. But grab some toys or your tablet.
What do I need it for?
We'll go to your grandma's house. We'll take care of her for a while and I'll take a vacation and stay with you.
Hooray!
Grisha squealed and rushed to collect his things in the room. I took off my shoes and went to help him. In half an hour, the taxi was already taking us to the hospital, and some weird things started happening there. That I no longer wanted to take my mom out of the hospital. Grisha and I went to the ward. My mom was laying and staring at the ceiling. She wasn't sleeping.
Hello, Granny.
My son cried out. In a few seconds, my mother got up and I got frightened, to be honest. She got up like a dead man out of a coffin. Her eyes were bored into Grisha. I saw her gaze, as if an animal was staring at its prey. Then suddenly she smiled.
Hey, grandson. Come here and I'll hug you.
At that moment, everything changed in my head. I recognized my mom. The medicine might have helped.
Granny?
Grisha was saying while approaching her. She hugged him.
So, how are you? How's school? Everything is fine, Granny.
The doctors were standing behind and couldn't believe their eyes.
Son, why are you standing there? Have you called a taxi already? I'm starving. I should cook something. We're going to my house, aren't we?
Yes, to your house. We'll take care of you.
My darlings.
Well, let's get ready then. I didn't understand what was happening. My mood just skyrocketed. But still, somewhere in the depths of my mind, there was a feeling of anxiety. It told me that there was something wrong. But still, the happiness of my mother's sudden recovery overshadowed these bad thoughts. We packed all our things, thanked the doctors, and left the hospital. My mom could walk on her own, as before. Everything was fine. She was smiling and gently pulling Grisha's hair. I felt relieved. There was such a feeling as if time had been rewound. For about an hour, we were driving to Mom's house. Home sweet home. Mom screamed joyfully when she saw her home.
Let's go. I'm gonna cook something to eat.
She yelled to us and walked quickly to the front door. Grisha ran after her while I was paying the driver. Have a nice day, I said, and went after my mom and my son. We spent the evening in a familiar atmosphere as before. We had a good meal and went to bed. Grisha had already fallen asleep. My mother seemed to be sleeping too. I was lying and scrolling through the Instagram feed, and at one point I stopped at a post from the page of our town. An accident occurred. The driver flew into the oncoming lane and collided with another car. The drivers of both cars died on the spot. Then when I paid attention to the car number and compared it with the number of the taxi on the application, I got stupefied. It was that driver who had driven us here. What a horror. I talked to him recently on the road, but now he isn't alive anymore. I have no words. After a little philosophizing in my head, I put the phone under the pillow and closed my eyes. I instantly fell asleep because I spent all day on my feet, and we also ate quite a heavy meal. I woke up from the sounds in the kitchen. It was just over the wall and heard everything really well. It seemed that someone was there, making some noise with the plates. I got out of bed. Being sleepy, I started listening to it carefully. What the hell? Having put my slippers on, I got out of bed and went to the kitchen. I locked out of the door. My mother was standing in the kitchen. I clearly saw her, even in the dark, thanks to her white nightgown. She was looking for something in a cupboard with dishes. I don't know what she was doing there, but suddenly she stopped. And one plate fell down the floor and crashed, making some noise. And my mother abruptly, like a naughty little child, ran very quickly to her room and was standing with bulging eyes. Last time she ran was 30 years ago. What happened just now? She rushed into the room like a teenager full of energy. I followed her quietly. I wish I hadn't done that. As it turned out, she didn't run to her room, but into the room where Grisha was sleeping. In the dark, I didn't immediately understand it, so I went in there and there was a real nightmare. There were insects all over the room. Flies, beetles, cockroaches. The room was completely filled with them. You couldn't even see the white walls behind them. And amongst it all, my mother was sitting on the floor, and literally she was swallowing my little son. Her mouth ripped open and stretched out to a size that my son almost completely could fit into. I was about to throw up. My legs immediately felt a terrible weakness, and I almost collapsed to the floor. And my mother kept on doing it, like a fucking snake. She was eating my child. Blood was flowing from her mouth, and Grisha's legs were still twitching in convulsions. I hit the light switch and the lights came on in the room. Mom looked at me as she vomited my son and rose to her feet staring at me. "Who are you? Such a beast?" I shouted out. In response, she started showering me with some unknown words. She was articulating them with her torn mouth moving in different voices. My whole body got goosebumps. These fucking insects completely covered me, and I could barely ward them off from myself so that they didn't fly in my mouth or somewhere else. Having pulled myself together, I picked up my son and ran out of the room. Having slammed the door, immediately, some spooky knocks on the door started, and I heard some terrible squeals. I was trembling as it were 50 degrees below outside. I ran into the kitchen, turned on the light, and locked the door, propping it up with a table. I put my son down the floor. He had no pulse. He was all white as snow. The eyes were protruding and the body was cold. In less than a couple minutes, I heard a rumble from the hallway, and the light in the kitchen first blinked and then flew apart with a crash. Mom must have gotten out, just crashed the door to hell. It sounded like that was exactly what happened. The light disappeared, and I was just sitting on my knees on the floor. I did not know what to do next. My Grisha, he died. He was dead. She killed him. She killed my son. Tears were welling up in my eyes. The whole life of my son flashed in my head. I lay down on the floor next to him, and I no longer had the strength to hold back the tears. A minute later, terrible knocks began on the door. They made me jump up and start thinking. Calling the police was not an option, since I left the phone in my room. And she kept kicking the door, and it seemed that the door would just fly out. In order to at least somehow detain this process, I started to store under the door everything that I could find in the kitchen. I took off the kitchen cabinets from the wall, pushed up the door with them. I even managed to move a small sofa that was standing near the table. I was insanely scared. From the one side, there was my dead child, and from the other was my mother, who only the devil knows what happened to. And she's who killed my child. Imagine yourself in my place. I couldn't come up with anything, except for grabbing my son and running away through the window. With shaking hands, I picked up the corpse of my son from the floor and rushed out the window. Thank God we were on the first floor. Jumping out the window, I fell to my knees and dropped the corpse of my son. Right after that, I heard a heartbreaking howl from the kitchen. She kicked down the door and rushed after me through the window. This was the last time I saw her. The same torn mouth, the same white nightgown smeared with blood. The same insects, flies, and beetles were sitting on her. While she was climbing through the window, I rushed to run with all my might. I was running, tripping over, jumping over the fence, and finally reached the road. The corpse of my son remained there. I still hate myself for leaving him there. I didn't even bury him. Being on the road, I managed to stop a car. I asked a driver to use his phone to call. I called the police and an ambulance, and I stayed there. I could not just leave it. In 20 minutes, I saw flashing lights flickering in the distance. 2 cars were coming. I stopped them. "Hello," I said in a trembling voice.
Good night. Have you called the police?
"Yeah, right. I called the police." I got into the police car and headed back to my mom's house. The cars approached our fence, and then, God forbid, something really creepy began. One of the policemen opened the door. The others followed him, and I followed the policeman. They come up to the door. I was told to stand by the fence. They slightly approached the door when suddenly my mom came out of it. Or rather, it was no longer my mother. She kept the corpse of my son close in hand. The police tried quickly to get the weapon. As soon as they brought their hands to the holsters, my mother jumped at one of them, dropping the corpse from her hand, and gnawed the policeman's throat. She jumped from one at the other, broke his neck, but the other 2 managed to get their weapons out and, screaming in horror, started shooting. I don't remember exactly how many shots were fired, but the creature fell to the ground. The police called for backup on the radio and called the ambulance. The nightmare was over. 2 law enforcement officers were killed. I was at their funeral. My son was dead. He was also buried the other day. For a long time, they were dragging me to all possible institutions, interrogated me. I told in detail how it all happened, but there were witnesses. 2 police officers believed my word, although they did not understand how this could happen. I sold the house so that I would never even remember what happened. But every night, I see the picture. That one when I saw the death of my son.